So I decided that I would make a video about finding rental accommodation in Australia. So I'd like to preface this by saying that I am not a real estate agent or an authority figure in this area or any area for that matter. But I hope that with this video you'll be able to get some insight or tips into how you can actually get rental accommodation, because in my experience I've lived overseas in a couple countries, and I think Australia, the way that you find rental accommodation is quite different to how I've seen overseas, and I'd say a little bit more technical in my opinion. So with this, I'm gonna probably in this video, there might be a couple different shots, and this might be recorded over different settings. So I might be wearing different clothes, or you might see a different background or whatever, because I want to go as in depth as possible. So with this video, if I'm even able to help a few people with finding accommodation, that would be amazing for me, because I know that when I first came to Australia, I really struggled with the process of finding accommodation, and I wish that I knew some things before. So I hope this video is helpful. First, let us maybe dissect the difference between renting in major cities versus regional areas. So basically, the rental market in major cities like Sydney and Melbourne, which are the two most populous cities, would be more competitive, and there's a higher demand and rental prices compared to regional areas. So in Sydney, this remains the most expensive rental market in Australia, and it's driven by its status as the financial and cultural hub of Australia. Rental prices are quite high, particularly in the inner city areas. Although some suburbs, I'm told by friends from Sydney, or satellite cities, which are basically a little bit outside the city, offer more affordable options. There is also Australia-wide like a housing shortage, so I think the population is increasing, but the houses being built are just not enough to keep up with the population increase. And therefore, this is driving up rental prices. In the past 1 or 2 years in Melbourne, there's been quite a significant increase across the board in property prices and rental prices. Suburbs that are quite close to the CBD in Melbourne, or those with good transport links, for example, quite close to the trams, bus, train, and those type of transport links are generally also more expensive. In essence, if we break down why major cities in Australia are more expensive, it's due to a combination of factors, including economic, social, and geographical. Cities with a high concentration of high paying jobs will attract more professionals from within Australia and internationally. Also, normally, major cities will be having all the universities, institutions, research centers, and these also draw on students. So, with quite a large influx of people coming in for job opportunities and for educational opportunities, this also increases the number of people that are looking for quite a limited supply of rental homes. And with people who have high paying jobs working in that city, this would also naturally drive up the cost of rentals. Moreover, the major cities offer amenities, entertainment, healthcare, and quite a lot of cultural experiences, museums, sites, things that you normally cannot get in regional areas. And for this reason, people want access to these cities. They want to live in these cities. They want to be part of the thriving culture in these major cities. And this makes them more desirable places to live in. With an increasing population, there's also limited supply, like we're saying, and the reason for this is because there's limited area. There's only so much area that can be developed on, and this will also drive up the rental market. There's also quite a bit of real estate investment in large cities. So basically, they will attract more investment from property developers and property investors who are looking to capitalize on the consistent demand for rental properties. And this in turn can drive up property prices, which can lead to higher rents. And much of the migration into Australia comes to the major cities. They're magnets for international migrants, and as we talked about, also international students. So basically, people coming for work and study opportunities. And this influx of people that's quite consistent will add to the demand for rental properties, and this will also drive up prices in areas where there's most opportunities. So, what is it that makes regional areas in Australia generally more affordable for rent compared to major cities? Well, for starters, there's lower demand. Major cities like we talked about, Sydney, Melbourne, and even Brisbane, have larger populations and more job opportunities, and this drives higher demand for rental properties. On the other hand, regional areas have smaller populations, and with these smaller populations, this leads to less competition for rental homes. And generally, when there's less demand, that means lower prices to rent at. There's also in regional areas smaller rental markets. So basically, regional areas or regional markets tend to be less dynamic. There's fewer renters compared to in the big cities, and this lower volume means a lower volume of transactions, and this means landlords don't have the same leverage as charging premium prices in high demand and quite concentrated major cities. Major cities also are economic powerhouses. They have large industries, factories, corporate headquarters, a high density of businesses within quite a small concentrated area, and this drives up the cost of living, by extension the cost of renting as well. In regional areas, however, the economic activity is a little more slow paced, it's a little more limited, and this translates to lower wages oftentimes, and therefore lower rental prices to reflect on that. Quite an obvious one is the supply of land. Regional areas usually have vast expanses of land available for development, and this leads to a greater supply of properties relative to the demand. So this excess supply keeps rental prices at a good level. In contrast, major cities like we were talking about have land shortages, and this drives up rental prices. There's also the aspect of transport and connectivity. I've been to quite a lot of regional areas, and one thing that I can say quite confidently is that major cities, in contrast, have superior public transport systems and more proximity to key infrastructure. On the other hand, regional areas have fewer transport options. The frequency of things like buses, the frequency of buses I noticed was significantly less than in major cities. And people who are living there, they're generally more reliant on their own cars for personal use. And this can make regional living less convenient. And for this reason, this can be a factor in keeping rental prices lower, because less people would want to move to regional areas, especially if they're reliant on public transport and they don't have a means to a car, whether it's for personal reasons or for financial reasons. I'd like to now discuss the places where you can find accommodation. There are many places you can look for accommodation, but the most common place where people go to, that's the first place they go to, is realestate.com.au, and this is the most widely used platform, and it's not just for renting but also for buying and selling. But obviously, if you're looking to rent, you'll go in the rent section, and it shows you properties across the entire country. So you can search by postcode, you can search by suburb, you can also on a wider level search by city, and you can also search, click the option for if you want to include surrounding suburbs. If you have a preference for being in a certain area, you can put the suburbs, put the postcodes, but you can also click the option for surrounding suburbs, and you can also find properties there. You can also, just like I think all sites, you can filter it based on when it was posted, as well as maybe the property type, such as apartment, villa, house, also property features such as if there's parking included, a parking spot, if there's underground parking, by rooms, number of bathrooms, central AC. You can basically filter it based on those as well, the smaller details. Or you can even have no filter and just start scrolling. Another website is domain.com.au, and this is another popular platform, and they offer a selection of rental listings, and also they offer market trends, neighborhood insights. You can also use Gumtree. Gumtree is a pretty good place to find rental listings from private landlords. When I first came to Melbourne, I went on Gumtree. But the problem with Gumtree is that if you if you look at listings online, as I mentioned, they're private landlords, so they could be asking for cash. And obviously this means that you won't have a legitimate rental contract. You won't have, you might not be protected by the rental rights and agreements. So this is something to consider, and I think I'll go into this later on in the video about the difference between informal and formal renting. But Gumtree normally has private rentals. There's also rent.com.au, and this specializes in rental properties, and it allows users to filter by property type, location, price range, and also it features detailed neighborhood guides. Another popular one is flatmates.com.au. In my opinion, what I've seen as most popular would be flatmates.com.au and realestate.com. So Flatmates is perfect for those who are looking for shared accommodation. So if you have maybe got a 2-bedroom apartment, so you sign your name on the lease and you're looking to share the accommodation cost with that other vacant room for the 2-bedroom apartment, that's when you put the listing online, and you would basically advertise for a roommate to take that, and you'd list your price, and then you'd be sharing costs of rent and also of utilities and stuff like that. So normally be half-half. Sometimes people would maybe have you pay more or less depending on if there's a master bedroom, a smaller bedroom, or the dimensions and stuff like that, or maybe there's some more features associated with the other room. But normally you split half-half, including with utilities. So flatmates.com, great for finding shared accommodation because you will normally have lower costs when you're sharing a property with someone. Normally if you share a property with 2 other people versus with 3 other people, if you're looking at the same property type, 3 other people will be cheaper. If you do it with 4 other people, 4 other people will be cheaper. This is obviously if you're keeping the property type, property location, and those other things constant. This is the general trend. So that's why flatmates.com people definitely do like to go on. It's also good for finding roommates. If you are maybe looking for properties and you know in your mind that you want 2 other roommates, you can actually go online, make a posting about yourself saying that you're looking for roommates, or you can also look at the roommate section and filter out and see someone you want to maybe connect with, someone who's maybe looking for an apartment or a house in the same area. You can connect with them and you can look for a place together. Facebook Marketplace, also a very popular one, and they have a good selection of rental listings. You can, just like Gumtree, normally find private landlords there. So with private landlords, that is also something to take into consideration. You'll also find maybe people on Facebook Marketplace kind of posting for lease transfers. So if you're looking to get something quick, normally people who are doing lease transfers, that's much faster kind of getting a place because they're quite eager to move out and have someone move in their place. With Facebook, you can search listings just in the search bar for accommodation rentals. Alternatively, you can join groups. So there are some pretty big groups with thousands and thousands of people. So over there, people will normally be posting listings. And many of these are oftentimes people who are looking to do lease transfers or people who are private landlords who are maybe advertising their property. Some of them are even formal agencies who are advertising property. So you'll find a mix of things. So you could either go to the search bar or you can join Facebook groups. Popular Facebook groups would probably be one, Fairy Floss Real Estate. This is a good group to join. Another one would be Roommates and Flatmates in Australia. And another one would be Australia Accommodation, Rent, Room Share, Flatmates, and Rentals. So that's Australia Accommodation dash rent, comma, room share, flatmates, and rentals. There's also oneflare.com.au. I'm not very familiar with this website, but I believe that they're basically for hiring services. So they're, I believe, run by Airtasker. But One Flare, I believe, also features rental listings in some areas, and that can help you finding homes, apartments, and things like this. Less commonly used, I personally am not very familiar with it. And finally, there is Airbnb. With Airbnb, this obviously is known for short-term rentals, but nowadays many Airbnb listings offer monthly or long-term stays. So this is especially in big cities like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. You wouldn't have too much of a hard time finding long-term listings. I would say that if you're maybe moving into the city, or you're coming into Australia for the first time and you don't know how long it will take you to find a place, staying in an Airbnb where you maybe book it for a couple of weeks or something, a slightly long-term thing, would be a cheaper option than staying at a hotel. So when you book Airbnbs for a little bit longer, if you stay there, then maybe in the meantime you can actually secure tenancy in a long-term rental. You can also potentially go to your community centers where there are bulletin boards. Also outside supermarkets, there are bulletin boards, and people do actually put some listings for some accommodation or rooms that are available. So if you keep your eyes peeled for some community boards, bulletins, stuff like this, every now and then you might be lucky and chance upon accommodation that's available. If you're a university student, you can also maybe go to your university bulletin board or community board and kind of see over there. Sometimes there might be listings for people who are maybe looking for a flatmate, or for people who are maybe renting out a room. Once you have made a couple friends, it might also be good to ask around your informal connections and kind of ask if someone else is looking for a roommate. I know that I had a situation where a friend of a friend was looking for a flatmate, and my other friend from another side said that their friend was looking for another flatmate. So I actually managed to link them both together, and they ended up staying together and sharing accommodation. So I also don't want to underestimate or I also want to highlight the importance of having some informal connections who can maybe lead you to the right people, the right places, and potentially link you up with accommodation. So that's also something to take in mind. Ask around, ask your friends, maybe even ask your work colleagues. If you're working at a place, you can ask them where the best place to find accommodation is. Sometimes if you ask your work colleague, they might say, oh yeah, this person is actually looking for a flatmate. Maybe you can speak with them, or maybe I can help you have a word with them. So want to highlight the importance of also having some connections. If you tap into that, it can definitely help you find some accommodation. If you're coming as a student, you do also have options for staying in student accommodation. So there's student accommodation that can normally be provided or part of a university. For example, if you're at a certain university, they would have a range of dormitories and hostels that you can stay at if you're a student there. Or you can also look for private student hostel companies. So in Melbourne, for example, the big ones are Igloo, IGLU, and Scape, SCAPE. So with student accommodation, normally that's quite expensive, but the convenience is that it's not as hard to get. The application process is not as rigorous because there are a lot of people anyway coming from overseas. They don't have much formal rental history, so the application process is quite streamlined with getting it. However, it's expensive, but it's convenient. Normally it's conveniently positioned in cities close to universities, and it's normally only open to students. But another thing is that because there's a lot of people that want to go inside these student accommodation places, it can take maybe 9 months to 10 months, sometimes even more than a year, to even get student accommodation in these hostels, in spite of it being so expensive. But I guess people do like it because they have amenities there. Electricity is already included, so you don't need to worry about linking utilities and electricity, and it's furnished, and also there's a community there where you can meet like-minded people, and oftentimes there's a engagement officer, so someone at these hostels to basically organize for these people who are staying, student renters, to maybe engage in activities, whether it's within the hostel or outside the hostel. So there are quite a few, in major cities, there are quite a few big private student accommodation companies, and those tend to be expensive, but well positioned and in pretty tall buildings, so they're like normal apartment buildings. So how can you go about this? For starters, if you're studying at a certain university, you can just search your university name and search accommodation or hostel or dorm, these keywords in Google, and you will see that maybe your university will have a dormitory. So with that, you can actually just apply and see if you will get a place. Also, your university website, they normally have an accommodation page. So if you don't see that they have a dormitory that's designated for this university, then that's fine. Oftentimes they have support with finding accommodation. So they actually have an accommodation officer who will try and direct you to the right places to find some of your own private accommodation. So you can also look there. When we're talking about the private student accommodation companies, then you can just search, if you're, for example, moving to Melbourne, you can just search Melbourne student accommodation, Sydney student accommodation, and you'll see options. These companies like Scape, Igloo, which operate multiple buildings, like multiple apartment buildings. Then you can go click on the website. You can also book tours. Tours are pretty easy to book, but the problem is that in spite of the price being quite high, as I mentioned, getting a place is quite competitive. So if you have the money and you're coming as a student, I would definitely say that if your budget is a little loose and you have the capacity, I'd say a great option is to actually go into a student dorm. You'll be able to make a lot of friends, and the vibe is quite amazing. It's very conducive to meeting people. And even then, if it's expensive, I'd still say it's probably good to maybe spend 6 months there if you're coming as a student, even if it's expensive. And once you've established some social bonds, then maybe together you can go and find private accommodation elsewhere where the price will be lower and you'll be sharing. So that is another thing that people normally do. Let's talk about the application process. So let's say you're on realestate.com.au and you see an apartment that you like. What you'll do is you'll click on it and you'll have a couple steps that you need to fill out. First is obviously your personal details. So this is your name, first and last name, and your date of birth, and things like your phone number, contact. If you also fill out the introduce yourself or about me section, that would be quite helpful for you because it allows you to share who you are, your interests, your hobbies. Also, it allows you to maybe talk a little bit about why, from the perspective of the agent and landlord, you'd be a good fit for the property. So you can talk about your nature, how you're respectful and you maintain boundaries and you're clean and stuff like this. So in the about me section, this is a good opportunity to kind of talk about you, your nature, why you're good for as a renter, and also maybe about your work and stuff like that. So you'll also need to have your identity documents ready. So this means maybe passport, visa copy, proof of income, pay slips, maybe past rental history, contracts, water and utility bills with your name on it, a driver's license. So you'll need a couple identity documents when you're also applying for this. Now, other information that's also very important would be your address history, proof of income or proof of funds, and employment. So for address history, they're gonna maybe ask you to fill out the past places that you've lived at for maybe either the past 2 or 3 years. So you need to kind of fill it out, where you live, the exact address, how long you were living there from, and 2 dates, and also the agent, the contact person. Reason is because when you submit the application, then the references for all of these places you've lived at for the past 2 or 3 years will go through, and the agent or the landlord will fill out these references. And this is very important for future agents because based on how you were living in the past place, the condition of the place, if you were able to pay your bills on time, if you were able to pay rent on time, this is a very important reflection for them, which is why rental history is very important. It shows that you had continuity, but also that you've been a clean and respectful and also reliable tenant. For this reason, it's very good to obviously have a good rental history and always maintain the property well, because this will help you when you're living in future places. For your employment, they'll also be asking about your current employment. If you're currently employed, that will obviously help because it shows that you have a consistent income that's being generated. And there'll also be a contact person which you have to put. So maybe it's your manager, your boss, and this, when you submit your application, this reference is also sent. So you have a reference sent to your past agents or landlords. You also have it sent to your current employer. So they will also need to fill out a reference to kind of fill out some questions related to your rental profile. So maybe if they think you'll be a clean and respectful tenant, and also for proof that you are in fact working at the company and you do in fact receive a consistent income while working at the company. And finally, proof of funds. So this would be pay slips that you'd want to put, and also your bank statement. You'd want to show that you have some money in your bank. It's also important to be mindful of what rental agreement is being offered when you're looking for properties. So generally, there's a couple leases. The first is fixed term. So fixed term is basically when a lease has a specific start and end date. And commonly, fixed term leases are for 6 months or 12 months, but they can be longer or shorter. Oftentimes what I've seen is that agents like it to be 12 months. This is what I see across the board. That's the most popular lease period. However, oftentimes there can be 6 months with view of, if it goes well, then it can be extended for another 6 months. So ultimately it becomes 12 months. So basically, people do tend to renew their leases after 6 months, and it's offered in such a way. There's also periodic lease, which means month to month. So this is an ongoing rental agreement with no end date, and the lease automatically renews at the end of each rental period. There's also short-term leases, which is a lease agreement which is typically less than 6 months. However, as mentioned, the most common leases that you'll see, rental agreements, will be for 12 months. You might also come across a rooming house agreement. Maybe on flatmates.com, this is what you might see. But this is when you're renting a room within a shared property, like a boarding house or shared accommodation or rooming house. So this is when a tenant wants a room or rents a room but shares communal areas. This means like the kitchen, bathroom, stuff like this with other residents. So the terms might differ from a standard rental agreement because you're kind of sharing living conditions. So the process obviously is quite cumbersome, because this is maybe one portal. Sometimes if you're on realestate.com and you like a certain property, then they might have their own agency or property portal that you have to then create a username and password for, and you have to fill and populate all of this again and do all the rental things again and put in all the information again. So it can actually be quite cumbersome and quite time consuming, quite taxing. Oftentimes for many properties, there's also inspections. So in order to submit your application, the last step is to actually go and view the house in person. And once you view the house, then you're actually able to put the code that the agent gives you after you viewed the house in your application, and then you can hit send. So with viewing, there's private inspections, which is when you can basically book to see that property. Just you on your own can book to see that property with the agent who will guide you. Or there's open house. So open house is basically when the homeowner and the real estate agent allow the public to view the home without an appointment. So open house, you can also maybe just be walking on the street and you see a property, maybe there's a sign saying open house viewing, and you walk in, and maybe you haven't even started an application, so they might give you a code or they might send you the link to this how to apply. And with that, if you viewed the property, then it's okay, you've seen it, and you can then apply and send your application that way. So that's also another way that people do it. But generally, you do need to, in your application process, go for a house viewing. That's normally how it's been, how I've seen it. Normally they want you to see it in person before submitting the application. So normally people rent either through the informal route or the formal route. So first I'll talk about informal. Informal basically refers to situations where a tenant and landlord agree to rent a property without a formal lease agreement. Sometimes this can be done by mutual understanding or a handshake. And I'll actually maybe talk about my situation. When I first came to Melbourne, I did not know the entire process of finding rental accommodation. I didn't know about these these rights that you're entitled to as a tenant. I didn't know about the formal body that governs tenancy and renting and stuff like this. So I went on Gumtree and I saw that there was a couple, and they basically rented out a room. They had a room for rent in their house. And what happened was, they basically said that this is a cash basis situation, so you'll be paying cash, and that will just ensure that you stay here. So she drafted a contract, and I signed it. I didn't know that this is not legally binding or whatever, but I signed it and said that I had to pay X amount per week and whatever, and there was a bond and that I had to pay and stuff like this. So the thing is, when I saw the place, I think the day after, I told her I was interested. When you're going through an informal renting process, the landlord just kind of approves it. So there's none of that. Very rarely is there that check where you're kind of checking with employers and you're checking past rental history from agents and stuff like this. Because the landlord said she was happy with me, the very next day from seeing it, we pretty much firmed it up. So obviously the informal arrangement was quite easy. There's none of these formal rental applications and stuff that you go through. It's pretty much two people agreeing. Obviously people prefer informal agreements sometimes because the administrative costs can be lower for landlords and they get paid cash. Also, it's easier for tenants because they're not really legally bound to a contract. They can basically leave more easily without worrying about breaking such a contract. With informal renting, people can also go on flatmates.com. Maybe there's someone who's got a 2-bedroom apartment and they've got the lease formally under their name. However, they want to sublet, and if they sublet, so quite often you may be the person who's paying rent for that second room, but you will be transferring or paying directly to the main person whose name is on the lease. So obviously, just like informal renting, that person is not very likely to look at employer checks and references and all this stuff because he or she would not be a formal rental agency. So there's less bureaucracy, and this means it will be easier to find accommodation. An issue with this is because your name is not on the lease, because you're transferring rent to this person, you are not collecting formal rental history, which is quite important. Also, you are not protected fully because your name is not on the lease. So this person could, if there's a disagreement, this person could quite easily just kick you out the next day or just demand more money. So you're not fully protected by the law. However, now I'll get into the cons because this relates to my situation. I basically had to leave. I told her that we basically signed a 1-year lease on this contract, and I'm saying contract because it wasn't even legally binding, and I didn't even know what a real contract looked like. I didn't understand the bond and paperwork and stuff. I didn't know my rights, and basically, without a legal written agreement, your rights as a tenant aren't very well defined, and this leaves you vulnerable to issues that arise. That could be eviction out of nowhere. It could be a sudden rental increase. And in my case, when I had to leave, this landlord kept the bond, and also I had other money that I paid, which was meant to be paid up front, and I didn't really understand the legalities and all, and that was also kept. So it was a bond and even more money on top of that was kept. Also, there's an issue with disputes. In the absence of a formal lease, misunderstandings can lead to disputes, and this may be harder to resolve without clear written records. Moreover, if you are informal renting, you won't be actually collecting any formal rental history, and this rental history is actually very important when you're applying for through agencies for places to stay. And if you don't have rental history, then this kind of makes it an uphill battle for you when it comes to you actually applying for formal places. Now, formal renting is pretty much like I was talking about, where many people go, most people go, and this involves a written lease agreement, and this is typically regulated by the state or territory laws in Australia. And this agreement outlines the rights and responsibilities of both parties. So obviously, a great advantage of this is that you have clear rights regarding rent, bond, repairs, eviction, and these are also enforced by law. Also, you have stability. Lease agreements generally have set duration, so you're assured tenancy for a certain period. As we said, often 6 months or 12 months, but most often tends to be 12 months, what I've seen. Also, the clear terms. The agreement specifies dates such as rent due dates, maintenance responsibilities, and it's very clearly stipulated. Also, penalties are written down, discussing breaking the lease, and this minimizes misunderstandings because everything's written there in black and white. Moreover, you have security of tenure, which is very important. Tenants are less likely to be evicted without cause if they have a formal contract in place. Now, there are some cons. There's less flexibility when you're going through a formal rental process. You're committed to a set period, which can be restrictive if you have plans to move around or your plans change. Also, there are potential rent increases. Some formal rental leases allow rent to increase after a certain period, often with notice, but this could still make it more expensive for long-term stay. There are also administrative costs. Setting up formal leases can usually require paperwork, bond payments, and possible application fees. Although most of the time I have not come across administration costs. It's been pretty direct. So from what I've seen, normally when people really are in a rush to get a room or a place to rent, they go through the informal route. They might go on Facebook and see someone is renting out a room. They might go on Gumtree and see that a private landlord is listing out a room in their home. So basically, because in informal arrangements, there's no application process, and yet you aren't really going through bank statements, and you don't really have to show employer references and past references and rental references. When people are in a rush to find something, they normally tend to get informal rental accommodation. However, the issue is, like we said, you aren't really covered by state law, so someone could easily just evict you the next day and you don't really have the paperwork to back it up. Formal renting is the one that I would probably recommend. Formal renting is the best because you're accruing history, which is very important for future tenancy. And it's also ideal for those who want security, clear terms, legal protection, especially if you're planning to stay in one place for a longer period of time. Either way, it's very important to understand your rights as a tenant under Australian law and the state law, especially for formal renting, where it's very well defined in the lease statement or lease contract. Once you've been offered a property and your application has been accepted, then you obviously will read the lease, and typically what you do is you pay 1 month of rent upfront, and also you pay bond. Normally the bond payment is 4 weeks, so you have to pay 4 weeks of rent as part of the bond. And this bond is basically what is stored on the side, and it will be given back to you with the condition that the house is in the condition that you moved in. So basically, if maybe there's some damages or things like that, or maybe some paint issues in the time that you were staying there, then that money will be forfeited from the bond to pay for whatever, maybe if the paint job costed $200, and then the rest of the bond payment, which is the 4 weeks of rent normally, will be returned to you. Normally you pay the first month's rent up front, but if you want to make an even more compelling case as a tenant, you can maybe offer to pay 3 months up front. And if you offer to pay the first 3 months of rent up front, it shows that you have the ability to meet the rental obligations, and it also makes your candidacy for tenancy much stronger. So if you really want a place, you can just tell the agent, hey, I'm going to pay 3 months up front, and I hope that this kind of increases my likelihood of being able to secure this rental property. You'll understand that it's really important to be organized and stay on top of your rental profile. So with that said, once you've started renting and once you've started gathering some rental history, maybe on your computer have all the files saved for your rental slips, for your proof of payment by each month, and also probably a continuous log of all your utility bills and stuff like this. So you have this all saved. Also on a document, you'd want to maybe have the exact address of where you've been staying, as well as the type of contract, the from and to date that you stayed, the agency, and also the agent and their contact number. So when you've moved to maybe 5 different places, if you have those 5 different blocks, then it's all saved for you. Because oftentimes when we move, we don't have these details at the top of our head. But when we actually have it all there, then when we're applying for the next place, we have all the details when it comes to actually filling out our rental history, all of the details are saved in our document. So we can refer to that, we can plug that in, and we can also put the relevant agent's name and agent's contact so that when you send your application, it goes directly to them. I'd also recommend putting a cover letter. So a cover letter for why you believe you would be a good tenant for this property, how you'll maintain it, your work, and proof that you will be able to pay the rent consistently and meet the rental obligations. Going further into the cover letter, it's important to highlight your background, your occupation, why you're interested in property, and also why you're a good tenant. So mention your positive traits in the context of you being a tenant. For example, your reliability, your cleanliness, your history of paying rent on time. And also if you have special circumstances, maybe you're moving from another state, or maybe you're new to renting, maybe you have a unique situation like you're here for a short time, or maybe you're looking to change properties because of XYZ, maybe you're coming from overseas for the first time. So explain that properly so they actually know your circumstances. It's also really important if you have prior history to make sure that you have very good references from your property managers, because if that is positive, it gives a positive character reference. It shows that you'll be a reliable paying tenant, and also that you will be a responsible tenant and that you will take care of the property. So many landlords and agents, as I mentioned, they do require an inspection before making a decision or before submitting the application. So make a good impression when you can. Be punctual, be polite, and be respectful, because this will go a long way. Also, it's very important to have proof of savings. You want to show that you have a lot of money in your bank account. Normally, the more money you have in your bank account, the more likely you are to actually get selected for a property. Because in black and white terms, if the landlord sees that this person has a substantial amount of savings, they know that they'll be able to meet the rental obligations and even more. So it's very important to also acknowledge that renting in Australia is very hard. I've never seen a rental market like this. When you're applying for a rental property, it reminds me of applying for a visa when I'm going to the embassy. So it's very competitive. When you come, you will be overwhelmed, but you will get used to the process. But sometimes there are bidding wars, there's high rental prices, and oftentimes a very tight market. A lot of people are, if you go to an open house viewing, you will see maybe 50 people looking at a property, and they're only open to one person actually moving in there. So it's very competitive in tight markets. And also I'd say you need to bear in mind that rejection is going to be very, very common. If you apply for 10 places, you might not hear back from any of them. You need to apply for many. It's almost like applying for jobs. Because the rental market is so tight, you're going to have to stay motivated. And the way you stay motivated is by continuing to apply to multiple places. And the more you apply, the more you understand what will kind of help your application, whether it's increasing your savings or proof of income, or improving your cover letter, or maybe applying more aggressively to more places in a short period of time. You can also be more flexible with your move-in dates. Normally, when applications are posted online, the landlord typically wants someone to move in ASAP. So you can be flexible with your move-in dates and say that, hey, I'm willing to move in ASAP. Because if you're ready to apply fast and move in fast, that also makes you a more compelling candidate to actually take that spot as a renter. A final tip is that it's good to understand what you're looking for and keep your budget in mind. If you're looking to be close to the city or in the city, especially if you're in the city, just expect that your rent will be higher than if you're in a suburb. The further away generally you go from the city, the cheaper the rent tends to be. However, if you're in the suburbs, it will generally get more expensive if you're going closer to the train station. So maybe you're in a suburb, but you're right next to the train station, it might be a little bit more expensive. If you're in a more central area of the suburb, maybe it's close to a shopping center, maybe it's close to other key spots. Also, maybe if the suburb area has very strong connectivity, for example, tram, bus, and train routes all together, then that area that you're in might be a little more expensive. However, if you go further away from the public transport network within a suburb, the other side of that suburb may be cheaper. So this is all stuff to take into consideration when you're renting. Also look at the area and take into account that certain areas of a suburb might be more expensive based on where it's positioned. I really hope that this video was helpful for you. This video basically talks about things that I wish I knew when I first came to Australia, and I wish I knew when I was applying for places to live at. So if I missed anything out, please let me know in the comments. Maybe I can make a more in-depth video about that particular topic. Or if you have any other questions, just leave a comment and I'll be more than happy to get back to you and maybe come back with some more information on how your question can be answered. But I'd really recommend do your research. This is just everything I'm sharing is basically just what I think is useful. But once again, do your research and best of luck with things. Bye.